All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This is the 10th annual VEX conference, and 10 years we were really hoping to see everybody in person, but we're not. We're here, but we are still excited to see you all virtually. And next year, fingers crossed, we will be back in person in Cleveland, which you are going to keep hearing about over the next 2 days. The theme this year is what's next. And after the last 18 months, we appreciate you taking the space and the time to be here. I know it has been challenging, but we continue to chug on, especially in the visitor experience world. So as many of you know, the visitor experience group is an all-volunteer group. We are dedicated to professional development for those in the front facing positions in museums and cultural institutions. The conference is kind of our main event throughout the year, but we do other things. We do a VEX Ed series, generally webinars. We have an ambassador program with people all over the United States. And we have both virtual and other in-person events throughout the year. So we do hope, while this is one way you are connecting with us, we do hope that you find some other ways to join us through the year. This year, we actually have over 100 institutions represented over the next 2 days. So definitely take the time to engage with one another. The conference really is about collaboration, both within and outside of your museum walls. So thinking about ways to do that, and definitely touching on the what's next theme. As you navigate the conference and the sessions, you should all have received an email with the different links to all of the different sessions. You are welcome to jump in and out of sessions as you'd like. We will always have a running main lounge. If you have like the side conversations, we're actually calling it the hallway because in conferences, that's kind of where you meet people after. So you're welcome to take those side conversations. We're happy to set up breakout rooms and the like. So there is a link to the hallway in all of your materials. We are recording all of the sessions, just a heads up there. And this evening, we do have some extra fun events. So we hope you'll check out the program and join us for that. They are included with the conference. So we are really honored and thrilled to be joined by Dr. David Pilgrim. A very exciting story. I'm going to let him do his introduction because I am sure I will not do it justice. But we really thank you for joining us, Dr. Pilgrim, and we are very excited to have you and hear your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. And I'd also like to thank Elise Grams, my assistant, who's going to be advancing the slides. I start with this first one. By the way, this quote is one of the most misquoted quotes that you'll ever see. I believe this is the right quote. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. If you do the work that I do, we talk a lot about the past, the relationship between the past and recorded history, the significance of the past. So this quote fits the work that we do. Next slide, please. This is just a little warning. The museum has over 20,000 objects now. A lot of those are objects and images that I think a sane person would find offense with the objects. I did not include a lot of those in this presentation, but I included the ones that I believe I needed to include to tell the stories that I wanted to tell. But I want to warn you from the start that I believe that much of what you would find in a Jim Crow museum is obscene. Next slide. I was in the museum one day, and keep in mind, I had been in there many times. I mean, we moved in our current museum in 2012. So a few hundred times I had been in the facility, and we have a lynching tree. We have thousands of everyday caricatured objects. We have segregation memorabilia, anti-Black everyday objects. And, it just occurred to me one day that what the museum really is a testimony to the resiliency of African-American people, that despite millions of objects that were used to to shape and reflect anti-Black attitudes and to support anti-Black behavior, anti-democratic behavior. Despite that, African Americans have done great things, and it was an epiphany for me. Next slide. So I bought my first object when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12. I was growing up in Mobile, Alabama. I don't know if I should say this or not because people may not think it's funny, but yeah, I recently did a 23andMe, and I knew that my folks were, they were Black, brown, red, and white, if you would, from Barbados, Trinidad, Venezuela, some of the nations that our previous president referred to as shithole countries. And when I first heard him use that expression, I thought he was talking about Indiana. So if I were in an actual audience, I would see if people were laughing at that. I bought my first piece though down in Mobile, Alabama, which is where I spent my formative years. I broke it. It wasn't a philosophical statement. I just didn't like it. It couldn't have cost much because I never had much money. And I've told that story before, in part because I want people to understand that I understand when I hear someone say that these objects should be destroyed. As a matter of fact, for many years, I referred to myself as a garbage collector. Next slide. So in the mid-90s, I donated my collection to Fair State University, which was and is the place where I was employed. I was a sociology professor, and I would bring in objects to class. I taught American minorities and race relations and intro to sociology, and I would use the objects. I mean, I learned about the power of objects to teach because one of my professors, when I was at Jarvis Christian College, which is a historically Black college in Hawkins, Texas, brought in a chauffeur's cap one day. And he said, "What does this have to do with segregation or Jim Crow?" And so we gave the answers you would expect us to give, right? That during the Jim Crow period, the United States was a race segregated job economy. And African Americans, in this case, African American males, were relegated to being butlers, cooks, chauffeurs. And he says, no, that's not the right answer. And of course it was the right answer, but not the right answer he wanted. So we kept giving him variations of the same answer. And eventually he said this: if you were an African American in the 1930s or 1940s, and you were a college professor, you did not make what white professors made at historically white schools, but you made a decent living, and you might want the same things other people wanted who had a little money, for example, a nice car. But if you were driving across, and we were in Texas, if you were driving across rural Texas in a nice car, you put your life in danger. And that chauffeur's cap, which you would keep in the passenger seat, if you were stopped by a white person, a police officer, or anyone, and they asked you why you were in that car, that chauffeur's cap said this: "This is not my car. I know my place. I have not violated the script. I am no danger to you." And I remember when he told that story thinking, if he can use a chauffeur's cap to teach this really profound lesson, then the objects that I'm collecting should be much easier to use as teaching tools. Next slide. So in the I guess it was around 1995 or so, the university gave me this tiny room. It was only 500 square feet. So really we were just visual storage. You don't have to be a professor or interested in teaching pedagogy to recognize that there's real learning going on in that classroom. I mean, look at them. Fair State University has a reputation of being an eyes-on, hands-on school in terms of teaching. Well, that's exactly what's going on in that picture. And in that little small room, beginning in the 1990s, people started coming from all over the country. Next slide. So I had two big fears, and at the risk of being melodramatic, I'll share them with you. The first one was, next slide. Oh, that was cool the way that slid in there. Was that I would die before the museum was built. And if you've invested the majority of your life in some obsessive way, the way I had collecting this material, and had eventually decided that it should go in a museum, and you're not making much progress, you're not raising money, you're not getting any traction in terms of building the museum, and you're getting older, as I was, then the fear is it's not going to get done. So that was my first fear. My second fear, next slide, was that my elders, African Americans who had lived through Jim Crow, that they wouldn't get it, that they would see us as a shrine to racism, or that they would see it as a kind of house of horrors, where we are making people think about lived experiences that were painful. And this was a really big fear. And I'm pleased to say that most African Americans who have visited the facility, including my elders, they get it. They understand that we're not trying to preserve the past. We're certainly not celebrating the past. We're documenting it. And we're using the material objects that existed in the past to try to help us understand the past and also the present. Next slide. So I hear people talk a lot today about creating safe spaces and comfortable spaces. I don't see those as the same thing. For me, if you're going to talk about race relations, and racism, it is going to make some people uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean that the space can't be safe. And by safe, I mean it can be civil. It can be a space where people can share where they are right now without being condemned. And that's what we've worked to do. So we use these objects, these everyday objects, these objects that you would have found in people's homes as teaching tools. Next slide. You know, this picture is a little misleading. That's actually not the Jim Crow Museum where I took this picture. That was at the Schomburg Center in New York. I was there giving a presentation. But anyway, I don't know. Okay, the brain just goes where it goes. All right. So the main thing here is I wanted to reflect on some things that I've learned over the years. I've been using race-based objects for decades as teaching tools, and I wanted to share just a couple things with you. Next slide. So this is a small, simple point, but I think it's profound. It certainly is in its implications for people that come into the Jim Crow Museum. I have to recognize that people come in there at different spaces, and it's not very sociological for me to use the term journeys, but on their journeys, they're at different spaces. They're not blank slates. I mean, they come in with prejudices. They come in, I don't mean that in a negative sense, I simply mean with prejudgments. They come in with a certain worldview. They come in with ideas about Black people and white people and race and democracy and what it means to be egalitarian and what it means to be fair and what it means to be unfair and what was segregation and the role of the past, the importance of it. They come in with all of that. So they're not blank slates. It's not just that we are, quote, bringing these objects to them. They are bringing themselves to the objects, their experiences. Next slide. So I'm also the Vice President for Diversity, Inclusion, and Strategic Initiatives at Fair State. And part of our challenge, and the challenge at many universities in this country, is how do you have productive, sustained, productive conversations about race? And there, I took this position at the end of 2006. I left the classroom as a sociology professor and moved into what was then the chief diversity officer for the campus. And one of the first things I wanted to do was to create spaces where we could have real conversations about race. And it's interesting, if you create spaces where people are free to talk about race, they will sometimes say things that you don't want to hear, but that's part of it. The other thing I noticed was early on, just the number of people that they didn't want to talk about race at all. And actually what I would hear people say is, and this would happen sometimes when I would travel the country, and at the end of a presentation, someone would raise their hand in the audience and they would say, if you and people like you would stop talking about race, racism would go away. And of course, that doesn't even make stupid sense. The reality is we talk about race all the time. We talk about it at a ball game. We talk about it in the corridors. We talk about it in restrooms. We talk about it in supermarkets. But we don't always talk about it in productive, constructive ways. And we certainly don't always talk about it in places where our ideas can be challenged. Next slide. I'm not a historian. I'm a sociologist. One of my friends just passed away, James Lowen. He did the book Sundown Towns and Lies My Teachers Taught Me. I think that's the right name of that. He was a great sociologist. And it's kind of interesting that a lot of his greatness is because of his work with the past, and the history that he wrote about the past. And as I read his books and books by people like him, kind of dawned on me this quote, and it's not especially profound, but I'll share it. Americans like happy history, narratives that make us look smart, brave, and exceptional. We want a history that has been cherry-picked, one that ignores our mistreatment of the weak and disfavored, a history that can be celebrated at picnics, parades, and in smug conversations. This approach to history is neither honest nor mature. The purpose of the Jim Crow Museum is not to make Americans feel bad about the past. There were many things in this country's history which are praiseworthy, but not everything. And if we're going to have an objective appraisal of the past, then it also means looking at those parts of the past that we should not praise. Next slide. So, and again, I kind of said that just then, that the goal of studying the past is to document what happened. It's not to make us feel good or bad. And right now in this country, everything's politicized, including interpretations of the past. So that in many quarters, if you look at the past and you look at it with objective eyes, which means that you're going to find some things that were awful, then it becomes like a referendum on the nation. No, what it is an attempt and an opportunity to try to better understand what happened. That's actually in the middle of the museum. When we move, we're in the process of trying to raise $18 million to move into a new facility. Our motto is, no check is too large. But we will probably have a lynching tree in there because you cannot tell the story of race in the US without talking about racial violence. And my friends at the Equal Justice Institute have done a really good job in terms of research in documenting more than 4,000 instances of the kind of racial terrorism that we refer to as lynching. Next slide. So we're not a civil rights museum. The US has a number of civil rights museums, and it has African American Studies museums. I have love for those places, but we're a museum that focuses on race and racism, and so it's different. So I was a little bit surprised one day. I was sitting in my office and I got a phone call from a representative of a donor who wanted to donate the originals. Oh my goodness gracious alive. They wanted to donate the original photographs taken by Bruce Davison in the 1960s. So you've seen these in books, but we own them at the institution. And when we move into the next place, we will expand the civil rights section of the Jim Crow Museum, because in a sense that represents the end of official Jim Crow. But it's really humbling. It's kind of validating to know that someone would donate, these images, and then the images themselves are so powerful. You think of Bruce Davison, a young white photographer who accompanied the people on the freedom riots, and he put his own life in jeopardy. And if you look at his photographs, he's so close, and so he had to have intimacy. He had to have the trust of people, and we got more than 300 of those photographs. I'm glad he took those photographs. And the reason I include that slide here is because I sometimes hear people, I got a email from someone. It was a white graduate student, and he wanted to do some history or some study of the past and write a history. He wanted to know, as a white person, can he tell the story? And I'm like, yeah, I'll just do it right. The past belongs to all of us, and good research belongs to all of us. And so I'm glad Bruce Davison took those photographs. I'm glad he understood, and by doing so, helped document. Next slide. So here's a lesson I've learned that I could never put into words, or it took me a long time. I knew that people were fatigued often talking about race, and they wanted it to be a question already answered. And then it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. This work will never be completed. And that's really heavy. We will never in this country, certainly not for many decades to come, or centuries, get to a place where we don't talk about relations between different racial groups or gender groups or any number of other groups. These are not questions where the answers are just done and perfected. And that's very sobering. Next slide. So one of the collections that donor, the one I mentioned earlier, gave to us was actually from David Leventhal. And they gave them to us because those are the kinds of images that we have in the museum. Actually, he could have taken those images in the Jim Crow Museum. It's very controversial. We've had a hard time finding spaces to show this exhibit. And so it makes me think about controversy. I don't believe that we should seek controversy. And I could tell you stories about artists and others who I think that's what they do. But on the other hand, we shouldn't be afraid of it either. I think that we can intelligently contextualize to the benefit of others almost any topic and ourselves. Next slide. So here's a great lesson. I would sometimes use some of my faculty colleagues as docents, and a student or a visitor or a student visitor would say something that wasn't well thought out, something that did not demonstrate nuance, or maybe something that simply reflected prejudice. And the teachers really struggled with not crushing the person. And what I've learned over the years is if I crush someone, I can't teach them after that. And not only can I not teach them, I can't teach anyone who witnessed it. There's a cathartic release that comes, and that's not worth it. To be right, to let that person know they were wrong. Doesn't, there's some cathartic thing there, but that's not conducive to teaching. Now, that doesn't mean I don't push back. It doesn't mean I don't correct people, but I don't crush them. Next slide. I think this is kind of a simple lesson, which is that if we all think something's wrong, or we all agree, like with heavily caricatured objects or with objects with the N word in them, that those are just wrong. Unless you're some member of some ideological group, you know that's wrong. But you don't get a lot of great conversations about it. The really great conversations we have in the museum are with things like Aunt Your Mama, where you have some people who see it as, the remnants or residue or ash of enslavement and segregation. And then someone else sees it as, and I don't mean this in a flippant way, in a kind of nostalgic way, right? It reminds them of good times spent with family members. And I think, if you forgive the pun, the stable genius of the museum is that we bring those groups and others together and people listen. Next slide. So, Tamsy Andrews, she's passed on now. Years and years ago, she was working at Ferris, and she had an art background. And she told me that she introduced me to visual thinking strategies. And I've never adopted it completely, but I love the idea of asking people, what is it you see? So right here, you have a license plate, which is from the 1960s, when there was a lot of talk about the new Negro and the new Democrat. And this license plate, which is an everyday object functioning as racial propaganda, basically says that the new Negro and the new Democrat are just rats. And so the black one is supposed to represent Martin Luther King, and the white one is supposed to represent Lyndon Baines Johnson. Well, when people come in, I ask them, so when you look at this license plate, what is it you see? And what difference does it make that it's a license plate? I mean, when I used to think of propaganda, I always thought of like grainy film or leaflets, didn't think of a license plate as propaganda. Next slide. Same thing here, this is a postcard. And again, if we were in the museum, I would ask people, so what does this say about African Americans? That they're not really human, that they're food for animals. What does it mean to dehumanize someone? Is it funny? Can something be funny and offensive? I mean, we use these to have those types of discussions. Kind of interesting though, now I'm having to explain to more and more young people what a postcard is. So, but if you know what a postcard is, and you realize how mainstream an object it was and how it went through an official, the federal mailing system, how someone purchased it at a store, wrote on the back of it, then sent it through the mail, and someone else received it. And again, kind of mainstreaming. Next slide. When I would bring groups into the museum, we haven't been doing this lately. We are going to do more of these when we move into the next facility, but I created some some exercises, and I put 2 of them up here. The first one is just to try to break down the tendency of people to censor. I did that. I showed some images at the University of Michigan recently to their graduate students. It was like 150 graduate students in there. And I put this image up and I asked them, it was similar to the one you just saw. And I asked them, what is it you see? And it was, people were afraid to say what they saw because they don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to be accused of being racially insensitive. And so it was hard to get them to really say what it is they saw. Well, this first exercise is designed just to do that, just to get people to just get that, whatever's in your head, get it out on paper. That exercise 3 there, called the placard, this is one of my favorite exercises. I have to tell you this story. I was at Concordia, probably shouldn't have given you the institution. I was at Concordia in Montreal, and they were museum professionals and public historians. And so I told them, I'm going to give you an object, and you're working as a group, and you're going to take some of the words, like what you would have done with the storm, and you're going to put it together and create a placard. And you can only have 25 words, and no hyphenated words. And as a group of 4, 5, 6, or 7, you have to agree on what those words are. So obviously the purpose of the exercise is not to create a placard. But I might have suggested to them that whoever creates the best placard, we would use it or give an award or something. I don't know. But the real purpose is just to listen to the dialogue, to listen to someone say, for example, you have to actually write the word racism in here. Because if all they're seeing is the placard and the object, they may not get it. And someone else saying, well, of course they would get it. If racist, they're looking right at it. And there's just this back and forth. That's the purpose of the exercise. And so when they finished, I collected them. And it was so interesting. I explained that the real purpose of this exercise was just to get them dialoguing about race, race relation, and racism. And they wanted to know who had created the best placard. And I was like, that doesn't matter who created the best placard. And they were like, no, you need to tell us who created the best placard. So I picked one of the groups. Next slide. In the Jim Crow Museum, although most of the objects we have are, we're on time. Most of the objects that we have are objects that, I think most people would call racist. We also have objects in there on African-American achievement, on African-American artists who use their art to deconstruct racist imagery. We have objects on, the civil rights movement and the like. And so it's pushing back. This represented some growth for me, because in the early days, I only wanted a museum that just had the racist objects, right? And my colleagues would say to me, you can't just have a museum that only has racist objects. You have to show people pushing back. And that was a great decision. And so a lot of our work now is in that direction. And the new museum that we're doing will do a lot of that. Next slide. So here are some what I call odds and ends, things I couldn't get in otherwise, and there's no good segue, so I'll just get through them. Next. We live in the residue of the past. I mean, this is a very ugly image, but it's a very ugly thing that happened. I think this was in Duluth. They actually have a memorial there. So we live in the residue, and that's just a fact. Doesn't mean that this country is not more democratic and egalitarian than it was in the past, but we still live in the residue. Next slide. And this is some of that residue. If there's a race-based incident that occurs in the United States, within a couple weeks, there are 2- and 3-dimensional objects that are created. And I know this because the museum also collects contemporary racist objects. Next slide. So this is a struggle for me. I grew up in Alabama. I was born in Harlem, but I grew up in Alabama. And of course, Dr. King was one of my heroes growing up, but so was Minister Malcolm X, and so was Dr. Du Bois and all these other folks. I mean, the whole February History Month group, right? Those were all heroes of mine. And, I didn't know at the time, but I was challenged. So I always wanted to believe this quote from Dr. King. It says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I think that I believed that without question, that even though progress was slow and sometimes so small that it was almost imperceptible, we were always moving, in that direction. And over the last, half decade or so, I heard racial rhetoric that was very similar to what I heard growing up in Alabama when George Wallace was the governor. And I was like, wow, do I still believe that progress, that we're moving forward, that it still bends toward justice. And you know, so it was a wrestling match for me. And actually, over the last year or so, you know, seeing these young people out in the street, I mean, that was very encouraging for me. I used to say that young people are our best hope. I now believe they're our only hope. So anyway, next slide. So this is almost trite at this point to say, but it's still true. I mean, a lot of times cliches are cliches because, you know, there's more than a kernel of truth in them. I believe the first work begins with ourselves, and that includes me. And then it means, you know, in our communities that we're in. Next slide. So again, I told you I'm vice president here of diversity, inclusion, and strategic initiatives. And so part of the challenge is trying to create a space where everybody believes that it belongs to them as much as it belongs to anyone else. So it's not a black church or a white church. It's not a black neighborhood or a white neighborhood or a red neighborhood. It's not a white museum, you know. It's one where where people are welcome, all, and where the people that belong believe that it belongs to them as much as it belongs to anyone else. That's a very simple piece. I think Elise got tired of me on that slide and she moved ahead. That's fine. I was done. So again, this is, you know, so much of this work involves speaking, right? I tell people that the life of an activist is the life of failure, because most of the time, you know, you don't get the changes that you spend your time trying to get. And but that work often involves not just actions, but also our voices. And I believe this in my heart. I'm a sociologist. We tend to be relativistic, but I believe this is an absolute. If it requires courage to speak, there's something wrong with the situation, not the speaker. That doesn't mean that it doesn't sometimes require courage to speak. It just shouldn't. Next slide. So yeah, this is, yeah, we're in a, you know, we've had many sort of iterations of civil rights movements in our country. Like when people say, oh, you know, the civil rights movement, and they're talking about the 50s and the 60s. I mean, they do disrespect to, for example, the work done by people like Belford Lawson and Percival Pratt in the 1930s, you know. But we're in a civil rights struggle. Again, that does not mean that we have not made progress as a nation. It simply means that we're not finished. Next slide. So I mentioned a museum. I mean, this is amazing. I am so excited. This will be the last project of my life, last professional project. And we're going to build it right in the front of the institution. Right now, we already have police officers, politicians, civil rights leaders, human rights leaders, journalists, museum professionals, and others come from across the nation and across the world. But I think there are bigger stories to tell. There's stories to tell about, for example, Jim Crow in the North, civil rights in the North. But I also want to tell the story of those people who spent their lives to make the world better. Our founder, Woodbridge Ferris, that was his most famous speech, was called Making the World Better. And it actually used to be our mission. Our official mission as an institution was to make the world better. And I think we can tell that story. I am so excited. Next slide. Yeah. These were some early images just to kind of give, can you imagine? I mean, we have over 20,000 pieces now, and we're getting thousands of pieces a year. And as a person who spent his whole life spending every nickel and dime he had to buy pieces, it's hard for me to say no, but I'm not the one who has to write little small numbers on them and inventory and accession objects. And so, but the point is that we're going to display through the visual storage part of the facility. Can you imagine like looking at 4,000 Mammy cookie jars, that kind of thing? And we're gonna have classrooms, you know, and unlike our current place, we'll have some interactive opportunities for people. We are probably the most artifact heavy facility in the United States for our size. And then I think the last slide. Well, no, it's the next to the last. I wish Ace Ross Perot had not used gendered language, but the sentiment is there. There are people that don't like the way we deal with race. They don't like the way we deal with injustice. They think it's too dangerous. They think it's too confrontational. And not to be defensive, but our pant legs are wet. And what I encourage people to do is, if you don't like the way we're doing it, just do it differently, but do it, you know? And it doesn't have to be about race. It could be about identity. It could be about class or whatever, but there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of ways to do that work. And then the final slide are the one, yeah, there we go. You can keep me out of Harvard, but you cannot keep me uneducated. As long as there are books to read, I control my education. We will fight to dismantle the barriers in higher education, but we own the education of our minds. And when I was growing up in Alabama, we were that first generation of Black and brown kids who were told this society is going to open up to you and you need to be ready. You need to read, you need to read, you need to read. And I'm glad I did. And I encourage others to, because when we read someone else's mind. So I think that's it. That's as quick as I can get through it, Nicole. And I'm here for a few or some questions.
Thank you so much. That was powerful. A lot to take in. So you are welcome to put questions in the chat and we can feed them, or there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Either way works for us, but feel free to populate. Thank you so much, Dr. Pilgrim.
Thank you. Did I make you laugh at least once?
You did, yes.
Okay.
There are several of the VEX people sitting around the table, and there was a lot of aha moments and laughter. So yes, you nailed it. Nothing yet. When is the anticipated opening date of the museum?
In about 2.5 years.
VEX 2024.
Yep. Well, maybe I said everything.
It's possible. All right, well, I don't see anything coming. Oh, first of all, thank you. I'm getting lots of thank yous. There we go. Okay, so there is one. Do you feel like there is some gatekeeping that happens with this work? Ellen is asking.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. So help me understand, like, who would be doing the gatekeeping?
Ellen, do you want to clarify?
Yeah, because I'll let them. Again, I would be sort of interpreting what they mean by that. In terms, what I would guess is they're asking, like, who can do this work and who can't do this work. And if that is the question, what our museum, our docents almost, over the years, they've been mostly, white Americans, and they've often been challenged, like, why are you doing this? As if racism is something only Black people can talk about, which is ridiculous. But what it has done, and that's one of the things I love about the museum, is that those are also opportunities for us to talk about that, if that makes sense, right? And so we talk about like who gets to facilitate discussions, participate in discussions, lead discussions, do certain research and the like. And so for me, and you know, and I've butted heads with some people around the country, you know, because they think only peoples of color should be able to, you know, do certain research. Or I just personally don't believe that. I just believe it should be done right. Like I hear people say like, well, we shouldn't have Black history or red history or yellow history. I'm like, okay, fine, then just do it right. So my whole thing is just whoever's doing it, just do careful research, and then yeah, that's simple for me. Maybe.
It sounds so. Ellen followed. She said, "How do you approach breaking down those barriers?" They've had experience with people that have excluded from a stance of these people don't need it. These people need it. These people don't.
Yeah, yeah, and again for us, obviously all people from all racial groups come into the museum, so we get, you know, like an all-Black church group from Detroit, but then we'll get an all-white Kiwanis club from some small city. I think we all need to have the discussion.
Okay, so now the questions are coming in. See, we just needed to give them a minute.
Okay.
Another question is, in your own Black community, what kind of pushback have you faced?
Yeah, it's not been, as I said before, it was not what I expected. There's been some, but it's so infrequent that when it happens, I think it takes up more space in my head because it's so infrequent. But it's basically, we need to forget the past. We don't want to see this. You know, and you know, one of my responses to that is whether we see it or not, or discuss it or not, there's not an object in the Jim Crow Museum that's not currently being made. And there are new racist images that are created every year. So the fact that I choose to not know about them, which would be my right as a person, right? I can not know about a lot of things, right? Doesn't mean that someone else, myself, for example, doesn't see the value in us documenting these things in the 1920s or the 2020s.
How do you help your docents understand how to correct instead of crush?
Yeah, that's tough. Now that is a learned scale, so I'm not going to have a great answer. But one thing is to just look at yourself and do an inventory about what I refer to as the need to be right and how to be right. For example, there are a lot of sort of, I call them like chest puffer stories, where it's like the lawn jockey, where there's a story out there that the lawn jockey was originally created because a Black boy named Jocko had frozen to death holding a lantern so George Washington could cross the Delaware. And so it's a kind of a chest puffer for African Americans, right? But there's no evidence that that occurred. And so we just talk about, like the fact that there's no evidence that that occurred, but also to be respectful of people, to listen. And a lot of times something it's false, but there's an element of truth to it. Like the what's the Willie Lynch letters, right? So it's fairly certain those were written in the 1970s, but in not doing enslavement. And so I have people come in and they'll go, well, the Willie Lynch letter says this, this, and this. And so my response is I think the person who wrote that had a really solid grasp of some of the nuances of enslavement. I think they were probably correct when they said this, and this, but the evidence is that letter was written in the 1970s or whatever, and not back then. And so just having a conversation with the person versus just, summarily dismissing what they said.
Okay. Can you describe your most challenging moment with fellow museum professionals in your career?
You mean with, well, see, this is being recorded, so so I'm not going to give you my most challenging one. But I will tell you that years ago, I'll tell you that years ago, there was a chance for the museum to be a part of a big city's museum. And it would have in some ways been ideal because of the, the funding and the resources that huge museum had. And there were one or two African-American community people who had some reservations. And the museum staff, not unlike some today, was predominantly white. And they met with the two community people and basically decided that they would not create the Jim Crow Museum in that large museum. And my challenge was this: why not have me in that meeting? I know why I collected this. I know these work as teaching tools. And so my frustration was that I had not been given that opportunity. Now that hasn't happened, now if we're talking to museums or corporations, whatever, I'm there because, and the questions, and Nicole, I don't know you, so I'm just using you as an example because your name is there and your face is there. The questions that you might find difficult about a particular object that we have, I might not find it difficult because I collected it, because I've spent 40 years, using it as a teaching tool. And I just have to tell you, that was really, really frustrating, almost to the point of being discouraging.
Okay. How have recent events of the past 18 months impacted the fundraising and attention towards the development of the new museum?
I think it's been, during COVID, we were closed, but we were open for virtual tours. And so we were doing probably more virtual tours than we used to do actual tour, physical tours. And so obviously that changed. The amount of donations, both physical objects and money, increased. So I guess that's the short answer. I think, but isn't it sad that that it often takes a national horrific videotaped incident to get people doing the thing that we believe they should be doing in a more sustained way. So, I said earlier, I think the life of an activist is a life of failure. I'd say that as a lifelong activist. But when you get victories, you need to understand them as victories. So when the branding of some major, almost iconic, Aunt Jemima and some of these other things, when they were revisited, we saw that as a victory, right? But some of my colleagues were like, yeah, but it took too long, or it doesn't change the poverty rate in the US, or it doesn't change the institution. Okay, yeah, you're right. It doesn't do all those things, but it is a victory. And so understanding the victories when you do see them, while at the same time pressing forward. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on creating points of access for people who don't want to acknowledge that their heroes did harm and damage as well as good work?
That is the deepest question I have gotten in a long time. And I have always struggled with that because I want to present objective treatments of people. I mean, no one's 100 and no one's a 0. And so when you look at, for example, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, they also did some awful things, right? But they're celebrated. But again, that's what I mean when people take the past and they have narratives that are designed to make them feel better about themselves, right? I look at the Black Panthers. I mean, there's some awesome positive, some things they did that were awesome in a positive way, but not everything they did was praiseworthy, right? And so yeah, when I say I struggle, I don't mean I struggle with whether or not to present a balanced view. I mean, I struggle to find the correct balance in terms of being accurate.
Okay. How do we encourage these difficult and important discussions, regardless of the topic in our museums, since race issues are embedded in everything?
Well, first of all, I always start with the local, right? So, and the most local is the guy in my mirror. And so this always has to start. Again, I said it sounds trite and mawkish, but I start with me and finding out where I have my own prejudices, and then I start with the next smallest group, right? So this would be the 2 or 3 people I'm working with, and eventually, that circle gets bigger. And there are all kinds of resources out there, but this is something, Nicole, that I've thought. The work, what people call DEI work, for most of my life, I thought it was all about the head, right? So it was, you do research, you do experiments, you do, it was a sort of a mental, it was all about the brain, right? I mean, I guess it still is. But the older I've gotten, I realized that it's also the heart. It's also about changing hearts, which, by the way, is also your brain, right? So I mean, it's work of the head and the heart, and it's work that starts at the smallest. It's about challenging ourselves while at the same time forgiving ourselves, and then ultimately, it's about putting some plans. Thinking through plans that have measurable outcomes. And so, right now as a campus, we're doing that head work. But a year from now, it'll be about measurable outcomes. How many folks are graduating and what kind of people are being hired, and did we decrease the number or incidents of racial bias and bias against trans people or gay people or poor people or whatever.
Okay, and I know we're coming close to the end. I know you said you had a couple extra minutes, so there's a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but there are a few about children and youth. You mentioned how youth are going to change. So in what ways do you reach them? And do you have any recommendations on teaching history that doesn't have a happy story to children?
Yeah. So first of all, I make a big distinction between the past and history. The past is what happened. History is what we say happened, right? In terms of children, and by the way, y'all have asked every freaking tough question because that is the most divisive question of all the things that our staff deals with. That's the most divisive among the staff, because some of the folks on our staff do not want children in the facility. I think, and some believe that people should start talking about race as soon as they understand words. I think where we've come down now is we don't do tours for people under the 8th grade, but folks will bring their own children in, right? And and we can't stop them, right? I mean, but so we've had that. I really liked what they did at the Mark Twain. And of course, we have the statements out there, and we're creating some media stuff about answering this exact question that people watch before they would bring their children in. But I like what they did at the Mark Twain place, because they basically had like the display, but then like a separate piece. And I think in the new museum, we'll have something like that, like a separate space for you know, for younger people. But I have to tell you, I struggle with this a ton. And I'll leave you with one last story. One of my children, my middle child, she came downstairs years and years and years ago, 20 years ago, and I was watching a racist cartoon I call Lazy Town, I think, or Scrub Me Mama with a Boogie Beat. And she was standing behind me and I didn't see her. I was in the basement. And she started laughing. And I turned around because I thought I was watching this in private. And she said to me, "Daddy, those monkeys are so funny." And I was like, "Baby, those are not monkeys, those are people." And she's like, "Daddy, you're fooling me. Those are monkeys." And I thought to myself, if she thought that, and this is my child, then people are thinking that around. So I, because of that circumstance, my conversations became more targeted or more direct with her about that. Yeah, I think of Dr. King, a letter from Birmingham jail, talking about the child that can't get into a segregated place. Well, like a conversation needs to be had, right? So it's a matter of like proportion. It's that person's cognitive abilities, it's their experiences, it's all of that. When I say cognitive, I mean the child. Obviously, a 2-year-old you can't talk to the way you would a 12-year-old. But I am not kidding you. That is the third question you've asked that I still wrestle with. And I don't mind. See, that's the thing about race and gender and all this other thing. It's okay to say we still struggle with that. It's okay to say I've changed from that, or I just don't know, and that's one, you know, and we have to answer that question again pretty soon as we open up this larger facility.
Okay, well, there's a couple questions we didn't get to, but I do want to be sensitive to everybody's time. But thank you. This was an incredible discussion. I don't know that we've ever had this many questions back and forth. So,
and we started out with none.
I know.
We couldn't even beg. We couldn't even beg people. Right?
And I hope everybody gets a chance to see this new museum and follow the progress. And thank you so much for being here. And we hope to follow all the work you're doing.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation. Have a good day.
Thank you.